Hey guys, thank you for joining me today as we continue, man, walking through the book of Jonah. Just started last week, and I told you, man, I love this book. You know, every time I go through this book, the Lord just reminds me of the times in my life where that He spoke to me, and I really didn't want to do it because it wasn't what I had planned or it wasn't what I thought it should be. And He says, look, man, look, I have the right to dictate your life because I bought you, I purchased you. You know, and we see in the book of Jonah how that, man, running from God or running from God's call on a life is not very beneficial. You know, I've often said that one of the things the Lord taught me as I walked through this book is that God has ways He wants to use me. He has a call on my life. There's ways He wants to use me. He will give me direction for that. And if I choose to disobey, He's got a fish with my name on it too. It may not be a literal fish, but He'll put me in positions, in situations to where I'll begin to realize, man, I need to come back to the truth of what God spoke to me, and I simply need to obey. Well, last week we looked at the fact that Jonah had a call on his life. It wasn't what he wanted. And it never pays to disobey God's call on a life. Man, God spoke to Jonah, a real person, a real God spoke to a real man about a real issue in a town called Nineveh. Nineveh's a big place, but Jonah didn't like them. He didn't want to go there. He didn't like those people. Man, he had been taught that not to like those people, and he did not want to go there. They were his enemies, man. He didn't like them. God says, man, they're living in ways that are wicked and evil, and I need you to go. I want to use you to go and to cry out, to call out their disobedience, to call out their sin. Well, today we're going to look at verse 3 at how Jonah responded. In verse 3, this is what we find. Jonah chapter 1, verse 3. It says, but Jonah. Now look, anytime we see but God, that's a good thing. But when we see but Jonah, that's not a good response. No, something's coming up is not real good, you know. It says, but Jonah rose up to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. So he goes down to Joppa. He finds a ship, and which is going to Tarshish. He paid the fare. He went down to go with them to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. So we see that Jonah did what he wanted to do. That Jonah made a choice to disobey God. You see, when God speaks, we have to make a choice. When God called Jonah and when He told him what to do, Jonah had to make a choice. Am I going to obey what God says, or am I going to do what I want? And the same thing is true with us, is that when God speaks to us, whether through His Word, through life, through circumstances, through prayer, when God speaks to us, we have to decide whether we're going to obey or whether we're going to do what we want to do. So we see that God spoke to Jonah, and Jonah made a choice. His choice was to flee. It says that he decided he was going to go to Tarshish. He goes to Joppa. He buys a ticket to get on a boat to flee from the presence of the Lord. You see, the picture here is that Jonah's here. God told him to go here. All right? God told him to go to Nineveh, which is this way. That's not what he did. He goes to Joppa. He buys a ticket. He goes the opposite direction. He does what he wants to do. So he goes, he buys him a ticket to go to Tarshish instead of going to Nineveh. And it says here that he is fleeing from the presence of the Lord. Think about that. That, man, Jonah's a prophet. Man, Jonah knew God. Jonah knew that he could not get away from the presence of God. So actually, this is what he's trying to do. He's trying to run from someone he can never get away from. To me, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but hadn't I done the exact same thing? Hadn't you too? Man, God's everywhere. We cannot flee from the presence of the Lord. I had a good friend of mine tell me one time God was dealing with his heart, man. He was trying to call him to preach. So So he lived in Mississippi. He moved to Virginia. He said, let me tell you what I found out. When I got to Virginia, I found out God was there too. He kept working on me. Man, we can't flee from the presence of the Lord. You know, I'm convinced that Jonah knew what the psalmist says in Psalm 139. All right? I'm going to start reading with verse 7. Listen to what this says. Man, we need to understand this, that we cannot flee from the presence of the Lord. It says, the psalmist says, where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you're there. If I make my bed in Sheol, behold, you're there. If I take the wings of dawn, if I dwell in the remotest parts of the sea, even there your hand will lead me. Your right hand will lay hold on me. If I say, surely the darkness will overwhelm me, and the light around me will be night. Even darkness is not dark to you, and the night is as bright as day. And darkness and light, they are alike to you. You hear what he's saying? He says, look, don't you understand and realize we can't get away from the presence of God? Psalmist goes on and says, he says, it was you that formed my inward part. You wove me in my mother's womb. I will give thanks to you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Don't forget that. God made you. You cannot flee from his presence. Says, wonderful are your words, and my soul knows it very well. My frame is not hidden from you when I was made in secret and skillfully wrought in the depths of the earth. Your eyes have seen my unformed substance. You knew me before I was ever born. You knew me in my mother's womb. Man, you formed me. It says, and in your book were written all the days that you ordained for me, when as yet was not one of them. You see, we cannot flee from the presence of God. We cannot get away from his presence. And that's what Jonah is trying to do. So God spoke, Jonah heard, but Jonah chose to disobey. And he goes and he buys a ticket to get on a boat to go in the opposite direction of where God was telling him to go, because it wasn't what he wanted to do. And he's running from a God that he can never get away from. And can I tell you, that's extremely tiresome. That will wear us out. I know some people now that I believe that God has a call on their life, and they've been running from him for years. And they are physically worn out, because we cannot hide from a God who's everywhere. So the truth I want to leave you with today is this. When God calls, when God speaks, we must choose to obey or disobey. We must make the choice, and it's never wise to disobey the truth of what God says. So where are you? Where are you when God speaks, and how do you handle when God speaks to you? You see, Jonah is a living example of God speaking clearly and someone not wanting to do what God says. And it led him into the belly of a fish. And let me say this again, as God has reminded me over and over again in my life, that he's got a fish with my name on it too. When God speaks, we choose whether we're going to obey or disobey. And my prayer for you and me is this. When God speaks, we choose to obey and to walk in the truth and to walk with him. I hope you have a blessed day. Walk with Jesus today, and let Jesus be Jesus in you. Thank you so much for watching Complete in Christ, as we strive to teach you about the Christ life. And we encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, and may you have a blessed day walking with Jesus.